Hey everyone, I'm hoping that just to make the listening experience clear for everyone, you just double check that you're on mute and we will get started. I want to make sure that everyone can see me. I'm Hilary Stamper, the online director for Alaska Wilderness League, and I am joining you here from Half Moon Bay, California, the traditional lands of the Ohlone people. I am so excited to introduce you to the speakers of this event tonight. And first, I just wanted to encourage you to make your viewing experience best by selecting speaker view. That way the people who are talking will appear large in your viewing window and it won't be crowded by all. We have so many guests tonight, so there'll be a lot of folks on video. You can also hide non-video participants by finding a video screen that has no video showing, and then you click on the top 3 dots of that panel and it will give you the option of hiding non-video participants. All right, so I'm going to get started. This Geography of Hope event is particularly meaningful to me because while I've always cared about wildlife and wildlands, the love of bears is really what drove me to work in conservation and with Alaska Wilderness League particularly. The stories in A Shape in the Dark, BJORN's new book, really resonated with me because they touch on an emotional connection with bears and the need to keep their habitat protected so they can thrive. And that's something that we do a lot of here at Alaska Wilderness League, is keep wildlands and waters where bears thrive in Alaska protected. So we work with a number of partners to do this sort of thing, and several have made this event possible tonight, and they include Mountaineer Books, as well as Alaska Wildlife Alliance, Salmon State, Salmon Beyond Borders, and Hearthside Books, which is a Juneau-based independent bookstore that has signed copies of A Shape in the Dark available. And we're going to share a link later so that you guys can get signed copies of the book if you would like. So right now, speaking of conservation of wildlands and waters in Alaska, I'd love to introduce our executive director, Adam Colton.
That little light back there that's
a little bit. Oh, I see that we need to do a little more muting. Sorry. He's going to talk with you about our campaigns to keep Alaska wild for brown bears and for all who treasure the unique landscapes in Alaska. So Adam, take it away.
Thanks so much, Hilary, and it just warm welcome to all of you, and see so many good friends and supporters with us this evening. You know, I know we're all excited about tonight's program, and a few things captivate and inspire the imagination than Alaska's majestic brown bears. And when you work for an Alaska conservation group, as I'm so fortunate to, you often get asked about your bear encounters. And if you allow me, I'll just share just one, I promise. But I'd say I recall so vividly many years ago when I was hiking from the Brooks Range down the rolling foothills in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to kind of a gravel bar along the braided Turner River below. I was with a friend and we put our packs down. We had covered a lot of ground and thought it was time to rest. We relaxed. We were enjoying the sound of the running river, and out of the willow bushes comes a bear right toward our packs. Now BJORN can tell me later how stupid this was, but we had canned salmon for lunch, and first thought that ran through my mind is not a good idea. But the bear passed our packs with the leftover canned salmon in it and headed right toward us. And I got the pepper spray ready and kind of was standing and, you know, what seemed like an eternity of waving my arms and talking loudly and kind of holding our ground. And the bear eventually headed off to the coast. It took a long time for my fear to dissipate, and we didn't stop hiking that evening at all. Of course, the sun didn't go down, and so that was good enough. But sometime later, really in reflecting, I realized what a gift that experience was, to be part of nature and not separate from it, you know, and to have that kind of experience in a truly wild place. And I think that sense of connection I also find here in our special Alaska Wilderness League community. You know, it's truly energizing to be in league with each and every one of you who share a passion for protecting some of the most extraordinary wild landscapes left on our planet. And I want to thank you for not just showing up tonight, but the way you have constantly showed up over the last 4 years, especially when places like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the Tongass National Forest in Bristol Bay were so at risk. You took action, you contributed toward millions of collective comments, you donated your resources, providing the critical financial support that allowed us to take the fight for wild Alaska to Congress, to the corporate boardrooms, and to the arena of public opinion, and to the courts. And you rallied to the defense of these national treasures, standing with tribes, communities, for wildlife, and with outdoor enthusiasts from all over the country. And because of you, there are still no drill rigs or seismic trucks in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. You stopped new old growth timber sales in the Tongass National Forest. You prevented brown bears in the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge from being lured to hunters with dog food or donuts, practice called bear baiting. You did enormous work. The list goes on and on. So thank you. That said, we need your help and your voice now more than ever. While the Trump administration may be done, the opportunity to fix much of the damage done and to advance a proactive conservation agenda, that the time is limited. We've seen it in the past, you know, these windows where a new president comes in with the support of Congress, but soon there's another election and potential changes in the political winds or people worrying about that election. So we've got good news in that the Biden administration got off to a strong start with executive actions halting the Arctic Refuge leasing plan and much more. And what's truly exciting is to see the understanding that President Biden and his team have that wildlife conservation, combating the climate crisis, and environmental justice are all connected. And one of the best examples of this is in the Tongass National Forest, America's Amazon, a giant carbon sink, a haven for wildlife, home to thousands of indigenous people and scores of tribes. Right now, the opportunity and the challenge is to make sure the Biden administration takes strong, decisive action to restore protections to 9 million acres of roadless areas that were lost when President Trump personally directed the head of the Forest Service to gut this 20-year-old policy. And in the weeks ahead, we'll be needing more and more of you in this regard. In fact, tonight, we're going to be telling you how you can engage your member of Congress to stand up and support the Roadless Area Conservation Act in support of these roadless areas, which would send a real strong signal to the Biden administration if that bill gains more and more bipartisan support. You know, the opportunity here is not only to protect the habitat of brown bears and bald eagles and so much more, but support the transition of Southeast Alaska's economy and its burgeoning commercial fishing and tourism industries. It's a hopeful moment. This week, we expect that Congresswoman Deb Haaland will be confirmed as the new Secretary of Interior, the first Native American cabinet secretary in our nation's history. And together, we'll need to demonstrate that we have her back and we're ready to make our voices heard in support of the most ambitious climate and conservation agenda in history. So again, let me thank you for being here. Let me thank you for the incredible work that you've done these past several years, and most importantly, for your support and your work and your commitment going forward as we work to protect the habitat for brown bears, places like the Tongass National Forest, and so much more. With that, let me kick it back to Hilary to introduce our guest speaker.
Thanks, Adam. So I'd love to introduce BJORN DIHLE, author of the brand new book, A Shape in the Dark, Living and Dying with Brown Bears. In addition to authoring A Shape in the Dark, BJORN is a wildlife and wilderness film guide. He's a contributing editor for Alaska Magazine and Hunt Alaska Magazine. He's been published in Outdoor Life and Sierra Magazine, among others. So BJORN, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about yourself and introduce your colleague, the award-winning photographer and bear viewing guide, Drew Hamilton.
Thanks, Hilary. Yeah, my name is BJORN DIHLE. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight to your computers. And thank you, Wilderness League, to be hosting this. I'm a lifelong Southeast Alaskan, and Yeah, make most of my money off of bears in the sense that either bear viewing guiding or guiding wildlife film crews. Drew Hamilton, who probably a lot of you guys know or at least have heard of, was nice enough to I guess host this for us. And Drew Hamilton is kind of the ultimate bear man, incredible photographer, really nice guy, and just a huge force for bears in Alaska and other conservation issues. Kind of, organized a lot of us and just led such a big push against Pebble when that happened, and just protecting the bears of McNeil River. So yeah, Drew's kind of, he's a legend in his own time, and it's really lucky to have him with us tonight.
Well, I just have to say it was quite the honor to be asked to do this. Thank you for having me. And when you first ask, and it really comes back to you meet a lot of people in the bear world, and there are bear enthusiasts, people who travel to see bears. There are bear fans, people who shape their travel plans around bears, and then there are bear junkies. There are bear perverts, as Bjorn likes to call them, people that are, I don't know if it's obsessed, but they've incorporated bears into their lifestyle at such a level that I feel like we're in the same category on that. And so what I was hoping tonight is we'll be able to get into some of those more in-depth bear discussions. We'll talk about the book. I'm super stoked, and I don't want to make everybody jealous, but I did get an advanced copy of the book. So I have read. All my roommates are jealous, and we've been talking about the book. And hopefully everybody will be able to pick up a copy if you haven't already. My only regret is that I did not get a signed copy. Bjorn,
We can make that happen.
Looking at you.
Yeah.
Right. So I was hoping we'd just jump right into it. And I was hoping you could go into a little depth on what was the genesis for this book. Like, what was the inspiration? What got us to this point that we're sitting here talking about this book today?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be raised in Southeast Alaska by folks who, encouraged us to get outside. And, I think it was either 4 or 5 when my dad first took me to Alberti Island, which, if you guys aren't familiar with it, it's called Kootsnuwu by the Tlingit people, the native folks who've lived here forever. And Kootsnuwu translates to Fortress of the Brown Bear, a rough translation. But he took me over there in August, and I can see, it's one of my earliest memories is walking up a salmon stream with thousands of pink salmon and, towering trees and walls of salmonberry brush, and just, seeing those bear tracks and being like, wow, this is, even like in a 4-year-old's mind, this is something really special. It wasn't just the bears, but it was all the life confined, on the stream, all these salmon, all these, ancient trees that we're trying to protect in the Tongass. And then walking up that stream and finding a brown bear carcass as a 4-year-old kid of a young bear that, appeared to have been eaten. Well, it was eaten by other bears, and just lying in the middle of the stream. And that moment was like, this is something powerful. This is such a special thing. And then just, throughout life, that was always kind of, the brown bears was always, and brown bear wilderness, that wild country is always kind of what grounded me. And then the book, I'd say, probably started about 10 or 11 years ago. It kind of coincided when I started doing brown bear viewing trips, and also starting to get published as a writer in magazines. And I just spent a lot of time by myself, in the Brooks Range on, long trips or long treks across Alberti Island, and had all these bear encounters. So I was already just like, as Drew says, I was a bear pervert without even knowing it. Like my obsession with bears was, for 6 months of the year, that's what I thought about more than anything else, partly as a survival tactic. Cause when you're out there, everything, the brown bears rule everything. Whereas, in the city, it's like, everything you do revolves around brown bears. And then in town, brown bears don't matter. But right around then, when I started doing the bear viewing guiding, I had all this extra time. Bear viewing lends itself to have a lot of time to think about things. I was just started thinking all the things that led to this moment, with our relationship with brown bears, my relationship with brown bears, like how did we get here? And, you know, I just started interviewing different people, doing lots of research, different hunting guides, different viewing guides, like why do we want to view brown bears, or why do we want to shoot brown bears, or why are we so afraid of them? And just examining our historical relationship with them of what led up to this point that we're at today with, you know, 2021. And so that was kind of, you know, 10, 11 years ago was the genesis of when I really started writing. And then, you know, if you've read the book, you see the format's not quite your typical format. It kind of interweaves memoir and interviews and history and stories, and I could go on, but that was kind of, I wanted to write a different book, and that book got shut down 10 years ago. But I used that same format when I talked to Mountaineers, I think 2018, and they wanted this book. I used that same format of just interweaving memoir, history, and interviews to create kind of this historical perspective leading up to this moment, and then kind of what brown bears and people are doing today in North America, in Alaska specifically, more than anything else. So
I have to say, as I was reading the book, that was one of the first things I picked up on. And you just so masterfully interweave the personal anecdotes, the science, the different perspectives, and the different people you've met on your journey with bears. And it comes across as just a very authentic Alaskan experience. Like you're interviewing these different people in the book, and I've never seen some of these people, but I can still just picture them because they are so kind of quintessentially Alaskan, you know, the kind of person you run into when you're hitchhiking on the Sterling Highway.
yeah.
Kind of thing. And it really, it spoke to me on that level. And so, you know, you've been in the bear world, we'll call it, you know, since you were 4 years old. And so it's been what, couple years, we'll call it.
Long time, Drew, long time.
And I know when I was this book caused reflection on my own life and my journey with bears. And I think about, you know, I've been doing bear viewing trips for 20 years now, and I've sprayed 2 bears in 21 years. And they were in the first couple years of me doing this. And then when I think back now, you know, hindsight's always 2020. Think back to those situations, and if I knew then what I know now, I probably wouldn't have sprayed them. And so I wanted to kind of elaborate on your bear journey and talk about the progression, or your progression and your changes in how you viewed bears, or your relationship to bears over the last couple decades, we'll call it.
Yeah, I mean, so growing up in Southeast, like I didn't know bear viewing was a thing until I was like offered a job as a bear viewing guide. Like we're taught to avoid bears, so like, you know, it's almost like a taboo. You don't get close to a brown bear. And I think, you know, my big watershed moment, and this was, you know, whatever, 5-6 years before I started doing the viewing stuff, was actually a pretty spooky bear charge where I almost was in the Brooks Range by myself on a long walkabout, and I almost stepped on a grizzly at like 10 feet in these willows, and there was a charge and almost knocked me down. But what I really remember from that whole experience was when our eyes locked, it was like I was looking at, and like, you know, it was just utter terror in its eyes. And then the terror just was like, you know, like switched to rage, switched to terror, switched to rage, and it did a bluff charge. But what I remember most from that was the eyes, and just like how, you know, science, biologists say don't do it, but how human it was. And I'd say, like, you know, through the, you know, kind of the evolution for me was like, you can communicate with brown bears easier than when you can communicate with most people. You know, I probably, you know, whatever, I've talked down dozens and dozens and dozens of agitated bears at 10 feet, and they respond. And that's like one of the craziest feelings that you can have, you know, with this animal, is like, you can't have it with a moose, you can't have it with an agitated person a lot of time, but like an agitated brown bear, like it responds to your voice, your body language. They're way more receptive, and they're so adverse to conflict. is what I really found too. So I'd say, you know, my progression was, and it's still like, you know, my job is to, you know, we do get close to brown bears, but I still like to give them as much space as I can. And if they want to come close or whatever, you know, I like to do that just out of respect for them. But it, you know, I think the big thing for me was how easy it is to communicate with them, which might sound crazy to some people or whatever, but it was just like, if you give them the chance, and time, it's, you know, you don't even need bear spray. Mostly, you know, some of these guys I know who've like done a million trips in the Brooks Range or worked around bears their whole lives, like they don't even bring bear spray anymore. And it's just like, you know, they have like a bear encounter that would cause a lot of people to shoot a bear or be the most terrifying thing of their life, and they're like, oh no, it was no big deal, he didn't have my wind, I got him my wind and it was fine, you know, afterwards. So yeah, so I think, you know, part of being raised in Alaska is, at least for me back in the day, was, you know, you do have that macho kind of demon monster mythology. And for me, it was kind of a process of dispelling it, to being like, wow, these are sentient, incredibly intelligent, incredibly sensitive, and incredibly anxious creatures. So, I mean, yeah, that's kind of.
Yeah, I think you nailed that. I mean, it really, I mean, for me, it comes down to that there's some moment in every bear person's career or life when they realize that bears are excellent communicators and they will tell you exactly what's on their mind. And it's a concept I always try to instill in people when we're taking them out. And one of the other things I enjoyed from the book that we talked about what to talk about beforehand, but I'm going to deviate from that a little bit, get into the more conversational stuff here, is, you know, as bear viewing guides, and you either take people out for a day, a week, however long you're out there, you've got your spiel that you go into. And it was really enjoyable to me to, like, we hadn't compared our bear spiels beforehand, but I see so many things in the book that you're talking about that you've incorporated. And it's almost a case of kind of convergent evolution, where, you know, you're in Southeast, I'm in South Central, and we're talking about these same concepts. And, you know, whether it's the scientific, you do go into some of the science in the book and talking about the genetic relationships to polar bears of those ABC island bears and things like that. And it's something I talk about here. Telling people how cool the Southeast bears are, telling them to go down there for their next bear viewing.
We just talk trash about your bears down here all the time. Like, oh,
well, you can come on up here when you want to see some.
They might be bigger and everywhere, but they're not nearly bears.
You know, and so also in the book, there's a lot, you know, because it is a personal story for you that you're telling, and, you know, relating it to other people. A lot of people have these stories, these emotional connections with bears, and you talk about Frederick Turner's idea of frontier, and it's how frontier, like traditional, like old school American frontier, manifest destiny, whatever you want to call it. Whereas Alaska now, in a lot of ways, is the last frontier. And so how do you feel bears fit into, or how do bears influence people's perceptions of Alaska as the last frontier? And how important is that, or are bears, to the Alaskan identity?
Yeah, I think brown bears are completely wrapped up in Alaskan identity. I mean, I would go out on a limb and say, you know, more than any other species, whatever you want to call it, frontier, wild, you know, if you want to call it wilderness, you know, or wild lands, you know, the spirit. I mean, brown bears are the spirit of the wilderness to me, you know, not more than wolves, more than anything. And so I think, you know, brown bears are totally wrapped up in, you know, who we, you know, even like, yeah, you know, Alaska and brown bears goes hand in hand, period. And, you know, I think that the Frederick Turner thing was so interesting for me too, to really start thinking about, like, it kind of gave us, you know, it was 1893, he wrote that paper. He was like some lowly assistant professor, if I got that right. And he wrote that paper just basically, and Theodore Roosevelt just latched onto it. And, like, you know, it's basically just kind of how, when we lose the frontier, we lose this vital component of what, you know, what Frederick Turner was, you know, what makes us Americans, our democracy, our, you know, what is important. and Theodore Roosevelt just latched onto that big time. And I think that's part of the reason why we have public lands, you know, such vast public lands, you know, and we have, at least in Alaska, this, you know, 40,000 brown bears is because, you know, it's a bunch of other people too, but Frederick Turner and those ideas, and Theodore Roosevelt was like, wow, this is something that is really valuable to, you know, not just Alaskans, but America in general. Is like, these wild places are super important. And I mean, once they're gone, we're going to lose something super important, even if we don't know what it is, even if we don't understand, you know, its value. It's, once it's gone, we're going to lose big time. So.
Well, and it comes back to a concept we were talking in one of our preliminary discussions about, kind of wilderness as a commodity these days. And we're in a world where we've got 8 billion people, and you know, wild spaces like we have in abundance here in Alaska are becoming the commodity. And how do we balance the ecology and the economy, and where are there places that economy and ecology can work together? And I feel that bears are at a very specific spot to help facilitate that relationship through the bear training industry,
like,
things like that.
Yeah, even if it's just as the poster bears of an intact ecosystem. And, you know, we've already talked a little bit about the Tongass and the roadless rule getting axed, but it's like, that's the most, you know, like our economy and ecology, especially in Southeast Alaska. And I recognize I'm biased because most of my money comes from bears, not to mention, you know, what I enjoy in life. My food too comes from intact ecosystems, because, you know, the deer and the salmon that me and my family eat. But it's like the road, you know, the axing the roadless rule, it's the complete opposite of what we need to do for our economy. It's taken away from the real economy of Southeast Alaska. And, you know, and bears are definitely a part of it, but to me, they're also just kind of like, well, if there's a lot of bears around, there's lots of salmon around. And if there's lots of, you know, there's bears around, there's going to be visitors who want to see them. So your visitor industry is going to be good. And, you know, so you have all that stuff. And that's why, I mean, yeah.
Well, and so this book that everybody's going to go buy after this it's about bears, obviously, but there are so many personal stories and things like that in the book that are about other species. You know, in your quest for bears, you're coming across wolves, you're coming across wolverines, you're coming across caribou and things like that. And so I wanted to have you go a little bit into how your quest for bears has influenced your perceptions or interactions with other Alaskan species that they might not be your primary focus when you're out there in the wilderness, but they're kind of an ever-present companion on your journey.
Yeah, I'd say, you know, one of the best things about brown bears is they humble and ground me, and I think a lot of other people who spend time with them, and they kind of just open you up. So it's like, you know, if you have any life issues that are weighing you down, just like go hang out with brown bears by yourself. Everything will get put in perspective really fast. You know, that freeze-dried meal, if you're lucky enough to have it at night, it's going to taste delicious. And, you know, just like that's, yeah. So brown bears definitely just kind of open you up. And yeah, I can think like specifically a 6-week trip I did across the Brooks Range once, just like I was by myself just about the whole time. And I just developed such an affinity for caribou. You know, it's just like, it was just, you know, I even had like, I've had them just fought like lone bulls a couple different times, a couple different trips, just follow me at 20 yards for half a day or whatever. And I don't know what was going on there, but so yeah, I think, you know, on these bear trips, or just like, you know, one bear trip that was a total failure because the weather was so terrible on Almaty Island. I was just like, I think I saw 2 bears the whole trip in 13 or 14 days. But like the shorebird migration, it was like, and all of a sudden I'm just like, and after that I was just like, man, I'm really into birds. And, you know, it was just like to have that. But I think, you know, more than anything, like if you want to call it a bear quest, you know, if you are in good brown bear country, you are in the most intact ecosystems left on earth. So you get to have all these other cool experiences with other species of wildlife too. And, you know, for me, it's like, yeah, I can remember like, you know, on these bear viewing trips where I get to see like, you know, see a bunch of bears, but then I'd see some migratory shorebirds and I'd be like just as excited, you know, just to see these other animals too. So, so yeah, I don't know. I think that kind of answers your question, but.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, the book, it's full of so many great, and you're such a top-notch, next level adventurer. There are so many stories in the book that really do kind of leave me wanting more. You know, you might just reference a story quickly, or you're using an adventure to, you know, a short story to set up a bigger idea. But there were just a couple things you were talking about, snowshoeing under the northern lights and things like that. And there are just so many of these little stories that I would like to have maybe pick one that you could elaborate on a little more. And, you know, you're out in the wilderness and they're just, you paint such a beautiful picture of it. And there's just this one story that struck me as kind of odd or disconcerting, is when you're out in the wilderness and you run into another person. Like,
Yeah.
so what is that like?
Yeah, that particular encounter was in the Brooks Range, and that whole trip was super weird and great. But yeah, I mean, I was going up the Central Brooks Range, and all of a sudden, there's a guy who's missing a lot of his clothes and looking terrified, walking down this creek in the middle. You know, it's the biggest, most wildest spot left in North America, supposedly. You know, whatever you can say that about whatever. But yeah, and then just like, you know, it's just like, there's not supposed to be people here. And, you know, here's this guy wandering towards me looking terrified. And the other thing about that story was I wasn't wearing any pants. I was just in my underwear because there's so many creek and river crossings. So yeah, this guy is super lost and run out of food for days, doesn't even know how long he's been out. So I give him my warm hat and my warm fleece, and we're about, I don't know, 40 or 50 miles from the village of Anatuvik Pass. And he was going the opposite direction, south, even though he was trying to get to Anatuvik Pass. And so anyhow, I was like, well, you know, just, you know, he's terrified of bears. He has his bear spray in his hand with the safety off. And I'm like, is this guy gonna spray me? And I don't know what he'd get, you know. I didn't have anything besides some food, which I was giving him all my food. But anyhow, yeah, so we walked to Anatuvik Pass, and after I think about an hour, that story got, it was, you know, it was funny, but I asked him to take his pants off, which I think that scared him more than anything else, because he'd keep taking his pants off every crossing, and we eat up all this time. I was like, hey man, can you just leave your pants off? And he thought that was hilarious. But yeah, but actually kind of a sad story, because I eventually realized he was a drug mule transporting drugs into a village. So.
Well, that's just a little insider information for some people who might be curious about going on one of your pants optional wilderness adventure tours.
It's always pants optional, Drew, if you're ever interested.
So then it would be a BARE tour, not a BEAR tour. Just kind of switch. It's a different market, really. So we just have probably about 10 minutes or so to keep talking about the book. And there are a couple more important ideas I wanted to get to. And, you know, there are so many ways that people interact or know or consume bears. And you do a very good job in the book about examining all, whether people are hunters, whether people are bear viewers, whether people are just bear enthusiasts. And, you know, in some of your conversations with bear hunters, which is a very different perspective than where I come from. And so it was very enlightening to be able to read those and have that deeper understanding of where other people are coming from. But the word intimacy frequently comes up in conversations with the bear hunting community. And I know I have my own perceptions of intimacy with bears and moments that I recall as special. And it occurred to me bear viewers and bear hunters are not necessarily that far apart. There's an obvious distinction in there somewhere. But could you expand a little bit on that idea of intimacy between humans and bears, specifically bear hunters, and then maybe a little bit about bear viewers and what that, and yourself personally.
Yeah, I mean, that was something that was really interesting, how, you know, in the whole word cloud thing with especially bear hunting guides, how often, if like it was a word cloud, intimacy would be a big word from our talks that we had, and that word kept popping up. You know, that I was asking mostly because most of the bear hunting guides I know, you know, a lot of them had never shot a bear for themselves. You know, and most of them, you know, really good people who really care a lot about conservation. You know, and some of, like, you know, Almerty Island and a lot of the Tongass too. Like, you know, we're indebted to bear hunting guides like Carl Lane and Ralph Young. We might not have Almerty Island if it wasn't for those two bear hunting guides. It might just be totally clear cut right now. So I just want to say that too. But that word intimacy, yeah, kept popping up. And, you know, I spent so much time thinking about, like, what does that mean, that intimacy to these hunters, you know? And I talked to some viewing guides and some who even hunted and did viewing. And the one who did that said, you know, the intimacy was less for the photographer than the bear hunter, you know, to smell the bear blood or to bring part, like a physical part of a bear home. So yeah, you know, I thought a lot about that, and you know, tried to be pretty generous. And, you know, I'm sure there's some bear hunters watching this. But it was just interesting when I told you this already, Drew, and a good friend of mine who'd been mauled by a bear, and I was having this talk with him, you know, how often the word intimacy comes up, and without fail, and he just like, you mean just like how a rapist feels towards its victim? And I thought that was a really interesting one side of the coin too, versus like some other sort of longing that, you know, is harder to articulate. And I even like tried to pin down some guides a little bit more hard on just like, what do you mean by intimacy? And, you know, and it's just like, you know, I can't explain the emotional response that a hunter has in shooting a bear. And I'm a lifelong you know, meat hunter. I just eat sickle black-tailed deer, and we're eating it tonight. But it's a different thing to shoot an animal like a brown bear, unless, you know, that's your food. But it's a very different, you know, it's very different. So.
And I think about specific bears that you mentioned in the book, whether it was the old female from Pack Creek that you talk about some very powerfully, you know, the last time you saw her and things like that. Well, we're getting short on time, but is there just whether it's from the book or not, just an intimate bear viewing moment that you would like to share?
Yeah. I mean, I could talk about that old bear because I'm sure there's probably people listening who knew her. She was the bear called Patches for probably, I mean, I can't remember if she died 2018. I think that was it. But she was, our best guess was 35 years old. And if you'd been to Pack Creek, you very likely saw her. She was on the cover of a lot of different magazines. She was a star of, I think, Fortress of the Bear, which came out in 2011. Her nose was had a big canine hole in it. Back leg was snapped, femur was snapped. But that bear was just like, that was the first bear I ever saw at Pack Creek. And, you know, Drew and I were talking beforehand about some of the people that were big influences on us, like Larry Allmiller for Drew and Ken Langhorn for me. And Ken passed on a few years ago, but that was his last encounter with a bear, was at Pack Creek. And it was, you know, he stepped on Patches. It was like mid-September. He couldn't see her or something. And, you know, she kind of got up and did her little thing. And that was Ken's before he passed on. And then when, you know, Patches died, that was my buddy who'd, you know, been attacked by a bear. I spent kind of years trying to get him out to Pack Creek or out to Almerty Island to try to have him, you know, I just, for whatever reason, I thought it was important for him to go back out and be with bears. I don't know if that was, I don't know, maybe it was my own baggage. I don't know.
I understand it.
You finally did after 2-3 years. And we had this night at an evening at a different spot where we watched 25 different bears. It wasn't Pack Creek, but it was somewhere not too far away. And then we hiked and paddled to Pack Creek the next day. And, you know, it was this amazing trip. And Patches was just lying out, I was sure she was going to be dead, but it was like early May, no one had been there yet. But she'd come out of hibernation and she was just lying there, barely breathing at the main little meadow at Pat Creek, just right off for where you view. And it was just kind of this crazy experience to, see my buddy who'd almost been killed by a bear. He, after a while just laid down, and she was 50 yards away, and they're both sleeping, these two, battle scarred people. And then we left, and that was the last, as far as I know, that everyone ever saw Patches, so.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned two kind of very different bear experiences there, and I feel you on both of them. Just being able to when you see like 25 bears in a night, or if you're going to some place like McNeil River and you see 40, 50, 60, 70 bears at a time, and you'd think those would be the most memorable experiences. And then when I think back to some of my most memorable experiences, oftentimes it's just a more intimate encounter with maybe a single bear, like Patches, like you're talking about. So whatever bear experience you have, it's transformative and powerful, and that just speaks. That's a testament to the power of bears, I would say.
Yeah, and just going back to Patches real quick. I'm sorry, I just forgot to tell part of the story, but that was, Stan Price, the bear man at Pat Creek. I mean, she was like 3-4 years old. Like she knew Stan before Stan died when he was like 90. So it was just really, for her to pass, for me, was like this, like kind of like really just kind of like, it was kind of I don't want to use emotional, but it was just a weird experience just to think of Ken Leghorn, to think of Stan Price, and just other people that, this passage of time, all located on this one little creek. And then Patches is gone. Like, since then, for me, Pat Creek is just kind of like, it's not the same. I mean, it's still amazing and awesome, but that history of that one bear, because I was so lucky to know her for 10 years. She's probably the ugliest bear that you've ever seen in your life. But it was just like, she hated, she was just surly too. She'd attack other bears. But it was just like, to have that experience, to like know her through time, was like, that's a heck of a gift to have.
So I just have one more question for you, and then we'll go into questions from the audience. But I feel this is an appropriate time to ask what you feel is the future of brown bears in Alaska.
I think we have to be really on guard to protecting salmon habitat. I think it's so important. We got all this climate change stuff, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners are familiar with what happened in Haines last year, where something like 40 brown bears got shot because the fish were terrible, the berries were terrible, and something like 25 in defense of life and property brown bears were shot around Haines last year, and another dozen were killed by sports hunters. I mean, that's one little area, 40 brown bears, and if we have another bad year of fish on those systems, then are we going to lose another 25 bears? Like, that's not sustainable at all. So I think there was a part of me, because supposedly right now there's more brown bears in Alaska than the last 100 years, and Fish and Game has done good management, but they have nothing if they don't have habitat. And those big numbers, those salmon, so I think it's absolutely critical that we protect the Tongass, so we can give the salmon every chance they have to come back with bigger numbers in places like Bristol Bay and Katmai. It's like, I mean, that's like the brown bear mecca, and we have to stay on guard and keep Pebble from getting in there, or else if we lose salmon there, then it's just like, I don't know, so yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic, but I'm also cautious about the future of brown bears. I don't think they're such a powerful, amazing creature, but they're also super vulnerable, and we always have to remember that. And I think that's one of the most critical things to remember about a brown bear, is that it's super vulnerable. One bad season can make it desperate, get shot by someone who trying to break into whatever, a fish smoker. And if we don't have salmon, then we're not going to have these amazing populations of brown bears. So I think, yeah, protect habitat, and hopefully, fingers crossed that the salmon don't disappear. So.
Well, excellent. Thank you. for that.
Thank
And
you.
I do feel
Thank
like,
you guys so much. Yeah, go ahead, Joe. Go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, like, there are battles, kind of, we'll call them raging right now, whether it's the Pebble fight, whether it's the Tongass fight, that have just instilled me with so much optimism for the future of brown bears. You know, we've had some unprecedented victory. There have been setbacks, but there have been some unprecedented victories in both of those fronts, and I feel that brown bears have played an important role in those victories. And so I just, yeah, I feel like all the people who have turned out tonight to listen to this talk on brown bears, like, you're part of the coalition that's going to be moving forward and save these magnificent animals.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, guys. And with that, I just want to introduce our Director of Development, Chris Konish, before we do some Q&A, which I know the folks have questions for you guys. So Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about ways people can help?
Absolutely, and thanks, Drew and Bjorn. That was just incredible. I know a number of us are aching to get up to Alaska this year, and that helps at least get us a little bit closer to see some of those incredible wildlife. So really appreciate it and appreciate the stories. And I know folks are eager to get into some questions here, so I just wanted to briefly highlight just a couple of different ways that we're hoping that folks can sort of step up and get engaged in the fight. You know, we talked a lot about intact ecosystems, especially for the Tongass National Forest, and we all have an opportunity to ensure that our representatives in DC are speaking out on behalf of the Roadless Area Conservation Act. So if folks haven't already done so, even if you have, regardless of how your representatives stand on the issue, do reach out to them and let them know how important this is. If it's a thank you message, please let them know, thank them for the support. If not, then make sure that they are on board with this legislation, because it is critical as we continue to move forward with this campaign. Likewise, the resources that you could contribute to groups, not just like our organization, Alaska Wilderness League, but to the Alaska Wildlife Alliance. Mountaineers Books is a great partner, Salmon State and Salmon Beyond Borders. We're all great partners that were associated with this. All do contribute to this cause, as we're all fighting tooth and nail day to day on this effort. So I'd encourage you to check out alaskawild.org/donate today. A lot of members are on this call. Very happy to see some friendly names and faces, and excited to say hello to a lot of new folks as well. And then finally, if folks are interested in learning more, sort of getting up-to-date resources, we don't have as much incredible images of the bears on a day-to-day basis, but we do have some great images up on our Instagram page, Facebook as well, and Twitter. And we do enjoy having some more in-depth coverage on some of our issues on our blog. Most recently, a celebration of 20 years after the introduction of the roadless rule into law. So I encourage folks to check that out. And again, thanks so much, everyone, for being a part of this. And I'll toss it back over for the Q&A.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, well, great. So we have a few questions, and let's see. Let me just start with one of the big ones, which is, can you tell us a little bit more about where all of these gorgeous pictures were taken? Are there some general spots that you like?
It's funny because I'm not a photographer, so that's generous to call them gorgeous. Most of those were from Albertine and Chichikov Island. You know, a few Brooks Range photos. So Albertine, Chichikov Island, part of the ABC Islands, that makes up northern and southeast Alaska. Incredibly dense concentration of brown bears, and so.
Great, thank you. And someone wanted to know what your approach is to talk down a brown bear when you're describing that. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that's like?
Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like anyone who ever sees me do it probably has a strange opinion of me. But, you know, first it's just kind of like little body language stuff. And it just kind of depends on what the bear is doing and whatnot. But it's always gentle talking is kind of the first thing. You know, like you're talking to a scared dog or a scared kid. And if the bear is kind of really pushing you, then it does get a little bit more forceful. And, you know, if a bear is acting like it wants to make contact, then it's aggressive. So gentle and, you know, aggressive. But, you know, the thing I always say too, it's like, and I had this personal experience, is I never yell at a bear until I haven't yelled at a bear in years. But I never, in the past, if I started yelling at a bear at 60 yards away that was kind of coming towards me, I found that once that bear realized that my yelling was just this, it didn't hurt. So it would keep coming and just kind of do what it wanted to. But if I really wanted to deflect a bear from approaching or whatever, I always found less was more. So I would never yell, now I'll never yell unless it's like, I think that bear wants to make contact and it's close. Because if I yell before, it's one tool that you can't use again. So.
Well, and it does come back to bears as communicators. You have to identify the motivations of that bear. And you think of like a mom and cubs, right? If you start yelling and waving at your arms, what are you communicating to that bear? You're saying, I'm coming for your cubs. It's not a situation that's gonna end well.
Yeah, so a lot of times with like an agitated mom and cubs, I'm sure has just been pushed around by other bears, I'll just sit right down and and just talk to her. And if she's if she is acting like if she's really mad, then I might stand up slowly if she's trying to challenge. But a lot of times she might just need you to just basically either slowly back away, or if you can't do that, just kind of sit down and let her calm down. So
you're actually having a conversation with that bear is what you're doing.
Yeah, and I've worked in emergency mental health for a while, and I just was like, it's just so much easier to communicate with an angry bear than an angry person. It just yeah. You gotta, like with bears too, is like they're so adverse to conflict, like real conflict, not just like little posturing stuff is no big deal, but like when a bear actually attacks another bear, it's like the amount of damage they can do just so quickly makes them really not want to do it, because they recognize that one little swat can be devastating to them or the other bear, and they avoid conflict as much as they can. So
we had a couple questions that are a little related to this. I'll just ask both of them together and you can elaborate as makes sense. A couple of them were, are there differences between black bears and brown bears in how you would respond? And then similarly, I've read a lot of your book and I really recommend it to everyone in this meeting. You talked in your book about bears that are used to being in higher density situations and bears that are used to being in low density situations and how they behave differently. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about these different ways that bears interact and how that would impact how you approached them.
Yeah, so you look at like Adam's story in the beginning about being in the Brooks Range and having that grizzly walk right towards them and kind of test them. And that's an example of a bear in a low density that's really testing someone, because it's not that socialized. So like a grizzly in the Brooks Range, if I see it a quarter mile away, I try to get out of the field of view. I try to get so it can't even smell me, because there's a chance they're not socialized. There's a percentage of them that are really are good hunters, and if they see you, they might just come running right at you, especially if you're by yourself too, because they're so hierarchical. If you're by yourself, you're way more likely to get challenged. So that's kind of that. And then if you go to somewhere like, if you're smart about it, place where there's 60 bears fishing one creek, they've learned to get along with each other. And a lot of times they'll just kind of react to you like you're another bear, basically. So it's like if they're tolerating each other enough, as long as you're not like, if you step in a prize fishing hole, if you step out of line and get in their way or something, yeah, they're going to be upset with you. But if you kind of, recognize, give them space and whatnot, they still might not like you, but it's not the same thing where they're going to like see you. They see something moving on the tundra, like, oh, that might be me, that might be food. And that's how that bear is going to stay alive, in the Brooks Range, because it can be so hungry up there. And then the other question, the black bear stuff, I don't have a ton of experience with black bears, and my experience with black bears is they're not as good communicators as brown bears. And it's still like they're not scary in the sense of like, brown bears is like such an amazing, powerful, monster of God sort of creature. And a black bear, you know, I have native friends, you know, who are just like, oh, grizzlies are fine because they leave you alone, but the black bear will come in and try to steal your kid. So, you know, my experience with black bears too, you know, it's like they're a little sneakier, but, you know, generally, like, you know, a lot of people in Southeast, they're just kind of a joke. You know, they're kind of a clown, or, you know, you don't take them seriously. And you know, everyone takes brown bears seriously, even if you've been doing it like Drew, you know, forever. You know, you're still like, you don't go out and not respect a brown bear. Or a black bear, you know, a lot of people I know just like, it's kind of like, oh, it's a black bear. So that's dangerous though. I mean, that's the thing, they're just kind of sneaky still. So
Well, and people want to have all these interactions be black and white and say, okay, if a bear does this, I do this kind of thing. And it does coming back. You're not interacting with all the bears in the world. You're having a conversation with one individual animal, and it's got its own personality. It's got its own biases for dealing with the world. And, you know, one of the problems that bears face is, you know, one person in South Central will see a brown bear do something. Somebody in Southeast will see a brown bear do something completely different. Somebody in Kodiak will see a third just totally off the wall thing. And suddenly all bears do all those things. When in reality, all three of those interactions were based on just single data points. So it's kind of it's a very, like we could do a whole other talk on just the level of intricacies in bear communication. It's a fascinating subject.
Is that a promise?
Sure.
Cool. Okay, so I'm putting that in the back of my mind, and moving on to another one of the questions that has come up in a couple different ways is how have the salmon runs changed since you were so small when you first shared the story of meeting your first brown bear? And in a, I think, somewhat related note, how are you aware kind of how the changing climate is impacting the habitat of brown bears, which is so inextricably linked with, you know, salmon streams?
Yeah, it's scary. I don't want to end on a doom and gloom note, but like I commercial fished on a number of boats for years, and I can just remember, you know, trolling, we'd have these 500, 600 pink salmon days where, you know, we release them all. And then I think it was like, I don't know if it was 2013 or 14, all of a sudden it was like, well, it was a 20 pink day when the year before it was 600. And then it was like, wow, there's nothing here. And then we had a couple, and I can just remember all along kind of the islands, you just see that black line of pink salmon kind of waiting to spawn, but all along the shore. And I haven't seen that for probably since 2013 or 14, that was a part of growing up. You know, this last year, the 2 years before this year, I mean, our salmon runs were just terrible. Like the bear viewing and bear filming stuff was not easy. And this last year we lucked out and we had a good pink salmon run in the ABC Islands, but we had no chum salmon essentially. And the watersheds that I was working on, I was, you know, out for a couple, you know, for the length of the salmon run. But it's like, I was very thankful to have, you know, a good number of pink salmon, not what we used to have. But then it's like, I didn't see a single chum salmon in a month on Chichikov Island, which is like, that's spooky stuff. So I think, you know, as we were saying earlier, we really, you know, there is climate change stuff, and we can, you know, help control that by preserving, you know, these productive old growth forests in the Tongass, which is also the most productive habitat for salmon, for brown bears, for deer, all the critters. So I think that makes it that much more imperative that we get protections for the Tongass. And Drew's lucky enough that right now he's still got a lot of salmon where he's working. But you know, in a matter of, and maybe it'll come back in 5 years, I don't know, but just in the last 5 years, the salmon runs in Southeast Alaska have been terrible. I mean, they've just tanked, basically. So
related to seeing the different bears, are there recommendations that you could make for anyone in the audience who wants to come and have some of these amazing experiences with you? And or, you know, with the bears in Alaska, what would you tell folks who want to learn more about this and how they can experience it?
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, the thing that you have to remember with bears is you got to respect them, and part of respecting something is really taking the time to learn and be humble around them. So I'd say book a trip with Drew, or if you're coming to Southeast Alaska, book a trip with Pack Creek Bear Tours, or, you know, if you want to go to Annan, go down with Brenda Schwartz. You go with people who've been doing it forever, and, you know, have that kind of be your introduction. And, you know, if you do have, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, yeah, I would recommend a guided trip, or, you know, going to some of these places you can go to without a guide and be okay. But, you know, where the bears are really used to people, and there's some, you know, like McNeil, you know, it's too late for McNeil, as far as I know, for people to get in, unless maybe if you're on standby. But you have, like, Drew worked at McNeil, so you have, you know, great people, staff out there that will help keep you and the bears safe. And, you know, one of the biggest things as a bear viewing guide is, like, you're not protecting your clients, is what I like to tell them. It's like, we're protecting the bears from us doing something stupid. And that's really important. Like, you know, we owe it to these bears to not push them or do anything that's disrespectful. And I think that's why it's a good idea to go with, you know, a reputable guide. So.
All right, well, I know that we're a little bit over time, so I'm afraid that we have to say goodnight to everyone. I did just want to thank you guys again so much for doing this with us tonight. It's been amazing to hear all these bear stories. And I just wanted to close with a couple lines from Bjorn's book that really tie in nicely with our Geography of Hope series. I knelt and placed my hand above a hole that had been worn into the earth by hundreds, maybe thousands of bears. I thought about how everything leaves a trail, whether it's imprinted in the land, in the narratives we tell, or even in blood. So something that makes Alaska Wilderness League supporters so special is that so many of you think about the trail you leave and try to make sure your trail sustains and protects our wild places. It's a trail that makes us all really proud to have made a difference. And we're so glad you're here with us tonight. And I hope you'll enjoy the book, A Shape in the Dark, Living and Dying with Brown Bears, and hope to see you on our next Geography of Hope episode. So thanks everyone, and good night. Thank you, Bjorn and Drew.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, take care.